You know, we've never really worked with Enermax before, and they actually sent a bunch of stuff for a giveaway. Them and Gigabyte will be kind of coordinating with our channel to give away one big PC, and you'll be seeing that coming in the next video, so stay tuned for that. But for now, I wanted to do an impromptu review of the Saberay, because this case is very peculiar. It's a very large mid-tower, by definition 7 PCI slots at the rear, but you'll see why there are some problems, some of which you can mitigate. I'll show you how in this video, but the whole thing is just, it's different, and depending on who you are, that might be a good or a bad thing. Thermal Grizzly's Carbonite pads offer peace of mind, ease of installation, and industry-standard performance in a market crowded with mediocre thermal compounds. Our own testing confirms that they conduct heat appropriately and provide a safe and consistent membrane between the die or IHS and cooler. Best of all, you can grab them in several sizes and reuse them as many times as you'd like. Carbonite pads are peace of mind in my book, and they're very consistent, and that's why I use them for CPU testing. Check them out via the link below. So I had to zoom all the way out of my wide lens to get this entire case in frame, and that's just a testament to how large it actually is. So there's about 1.5 to 2 inches of space below the actual case itself. These feet are massive, but it keeps it rather sturdy. A lot of the build construction here, especially on the exterior, is plastic, which is a bit disappointing, but because the feet are so wide, they've actually done a good job at least keeping it stable while it's on a desk. And then up top, you've got another 1.5 to 2 inches of just extra space. If you wanted to do a push-pull config, you could certainly do that. We'll talk about airflow here in a second. But this is just a case that can kind of fit anything you could possibly want within reason, right? So up to a 360mm up front. I believe you can support up to, it looks like a 360mm up top, but I'll have to look up whether or not that is actually the case, because there's also an optical drive bay little area up front, which is convenient for some of you who want the CD drive, the DVD drive, whatever. That's an option. You don't have to use it though. And the good thing is it doesn't look terrible when you don't include an optical drive bay. Some cases have that extra space and it just looks really weird and unused, but Enermax has done a decent job filling out the extra space. Enermax does offer this case in white and black variants, which is convenient. Obviously for this kind of config, black would have been better, but that's not their fault. This is just what I use for every case review for obvious reasons. You have 2 large LED strips up top and up front. They're actually interconnected. They can be controlled by one button up top, and they all connect to a fan hub, also acts as an RGB LED hub at the rear. The only bad thing about this integrated hub is the fact that you only get 3-pin fan support, which is a bit disappointing, so you're only gonna have voltage control here. The good thing is the fans that they include, you get 4 of them by the way, 3 of which are RGB LED integrated up front, are also 3-pin fans. So you're gonna only have voltage control, which means you can't get them super quiet, but to my surprise, you actually kind of could. For being voltage fans, the natural RPM state of these fans is pretty low. So if you're running them on like the first setting, which you can configure up top, there's a little fan controller up there, they're actually super quiet. So I'm not really gonna complain for once about the fact that there's only voltage control on this hub. Speaking of those fans, the 3 up front are 120mm fans. The RGBs kind of wrap around the entire fan frame, which is a unique look. And then at the rear, you get a single 140mm fan. It's not the quietest, but it does have like rubber vibration mounts and things that you would expect to find in a $150 case, which is what this is roughly gonna run you. Enermax did a great job including rubber grommets here. You get 2 up top for those 2 large cutouts above the motherboard. You also get 2 in the basement, which is not something we're used to seeing. Usually those at the bottom don't have rubber grommets. These do. It looks really clean, cleans up the cables. You also get a PCIe cutout as well. It's not as wide as I would like, so again, 2 8-pins, gonna kind of crunch those at the base, but it's a nice inclusion nonetheless. Now, as for the area next to the motherboard tray itself, this is where the design queue gets a little questionable, because first off, you get no rubber grommets at all for like the 24-pin or USB 3.0 or Type-C, whatever. You don't get that at all. There's just a little kind of space there for you to route cables. It's an indented area, so you have space to actually mount 2 fans, although the exhaust array on the right panel is not very forgiving. The cutouts themselves are very restricted, so I don't have a feeling these would be very functional. Also, if you choose not to populate that area with fans, which is what I've done here, it just looks a little bare, and you can see through it. You can see the cables that you're routing behind it. It's a convenient place to route cables, but I tried my best to keep those out of the way for this build because it just looks really dumb, in my opinion, to have all those cables kind of exposed. Like the whole point is to hide those behind the motherboard tray. So it's kind of a catch-22. You want to put most of your cables behind that section of the tray because there's more space there. Behind the motherboard tray directly, there's only about 3/4 of an inch worth of clearance. That's not enough for a lot of the thicker cables, especially if you're running like cable extensions or even with the fan hub there. It just makes things rather cluttered. So you're gonna want to put those cables, again, near this little double fan mount indentation next to the motherboard tray, and it's just, there's no cover there. I would like Enermax to include some sort of like modular cover to block that off so that you could freely run cables there, and that would be perfect, similar to what Fractal Design does or what Fantex does. We don't have that though, so it was difficult, needless to say, to keep those cables out of sight, and I couldn't make it perfect, clearly. You also have a large cutout in the basement for a fairly thick rad. I would say definitely around 45mm thick rad should fit, as long as you keep the stock fans in front of that frame. PSU support down below in terms of length is adequate. You actually have room to stuff extra cables even with a slightly extended ATX power supply. You've also got a hard drive cage down below with 2 toolless hard drive brackets. That is convenient, and then 2 dedicated SSD brackets behind the motherboard tray. Now, pet peeve of mine with white chassis is tinted tempered glass. I'm not a big fan of that, especially with these kinds of cases, because you want to be able to see the fact that the internals are white, and you can't do that with tinted glass, especially if you're using like other white components. All you're going to see are the LEDs when your build is on. So in this case, Enermax actually did a good job, at least in my opinion. You might not agree with me here, but I really like that this is like very slightly tinted tempered glass. So you can see everything inside, even when the build is off, individual components. It's very easy to do, and it looks really good. Speaking of tempered glass, the left panel is the only place you'll find it, and there are 4 thumb screws that hold it in place. With questionable Phillips screw inclusion, I'm not sure why they did this. My concern wouldn't be that these would come loose during shipping. It would be, you know, someone like slamming a Phillips screwdriver into it or kicking it when, you know, they're shipping it, right? UPS, FedEx, we all know that stuff like that happens. So I'm not sure why they did this, but they're very easy to remove without a tool. So maybe some of these come over torqued, but yeah, that and the fact that they're also like bare steel or whatever this metal or alloy is. These could have been black, and I think it would have looked a lot better. So that's another design key that I think they really could have touched on. It is nice though that you have a black trim going around the outside of the tempered glass. It's all stuck to the chassis itself, and this makes for just a little smoother tempered glass application, and it's not going to be rubbing against this steel or plastic frame. As for the right panel, again, we have these small slits here for questionable amounts of airflow. I'm not even going to test this because it just doesn't look very practical, but there are only 2 thumb screws needed to hold this in place, and they're both up top. The bottom of the panel just kind of slides into the frame, so a little easier installation on this side, but nothing really worth getting too excited about. Now, speaking of airflow, that's what I want to focus the remainder of this video on, because this was interesting, and I had to run 4 separate tests because Enermax includes an optional mesh front panel, and there's apparently also an optional mesh top panel. The mesh was already included on top of this one, but the stock config is to have, it's like an acrylic front panel and acrylic top panel, and that completely closes off both sides. So obviously it wouldn't be ideal to have both of those installed. You could put the acrylic up top if you have no fans up top, but then also putting it up front will completely choke these fans. You'll see temperature results here in a second. It totally makes sense what you're seeing, because there's no air at all for these fans up front to pull. This is what that panel looks like. Again, I'm assuming it's acrylic because it's flexible. It's not glass, and that's probably what most of you are concerned about, and nonetheless, it's going to completely block airflow, especially when mounted up front. Now, I do have the mesh installed up front and up top for obvious reasons. We want to maximize airflow, get it as close to ideal as possible in these scenarios, and stock, the mesh config also didn't do that well. Actually, only lowered our CPU temps by 1 degree, swapping from this to the mesh. And I know what you're thinking. There's no way that's possible, Greg. This is way more porous. This is literally like completely blocked off. At least there's some space up front, right? Well, the way you're seeing it now, I've modified it. It's very easy to do. I'm gonna show you what I did, and that will drastically reduce your temperatures. So there are 3 separate layers that make up this mesh front panel. First off, you've got that white kind of honeycomb frame underneath. That's needed for structural rigidity, not gonna mess up really much of anything in terms of airflow. The uppermost layer is a hole-punched metal grill, and the middle layer is another hole punched metal grill. I think they wanted this one to act as the dust filter. The problem with that thinking is that, okay, so they got the holes about this size, right? Well, the holes on the uppermost metal grill are about the same size. So that's already doing whatever job this was going to do in terms of blocking dust or preventing dust from getting into your case. So they put 2 here for redundancy, but what that does is massively choke your airflow. So what I did was I removed this central panel. The uppermost metal grill kind of wraps around the white honeycomb frame. You can remove that by bending these tabs around the perimeter, and then you can remove very easily this metal dust filter here in the middle. Actually, I'm not even sure this is metal. It probably is. It's, you know, the typical ones that you find in most cases. Problem is when you have this also stacked against another one that's just like this, you're literally cutting airflow again in half, and that's not ideal, and that is why our temperatures looked bad. So you can see with the front panel on, completely covered with that acrylic, the CPU reached 90 degrees Celsius and the GPU reached 71. That's actually the hottest I think we've ever had our GPU get for any of our case tests. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's the hottest I've ever seen it. And that means that our graphics card is really getting no airflow. And also at the rear of this case, the PCI slot covers are a little more restricted. We don't have that typical hole punch kind of mesh at the rear. We have these little vertical slits in each of the slots. And I just think that this is reducing the amount of air that the graphics card can pull in from the rear. And then with the acrylic panel swapped for the mesh panel, as it comes stock in the box, remember with technically 2 dust filters in there, the CPU was still at 90 degrees Celsius after 15 minutes of IDA64 Engineer, and the GPU dropped by 1 degree Celsius. That tells me that our entire system is still being choked for air. So at this point I got curious, I removed the front panel entirely. This test would act as our control. That lowered CPU temps to 79 degrees Celsius. Our GPU leveled off at 64 degrees Celsius. This is in line with other cases that I've reviewed with this exact config. That tells us that, again, acting as our control, there is nothing inherently wrong with the way I am testing the case. And then the last thing I did was remove this middle dust filter. Now, yes, you're going to have a bit more dust creep its way into your case over time, but which are you more concerned about? A little bit of dust or your system running 10 degrees hotter? And that's almost exactly what CPU temps were lowered by. In the case of the modded front panel, CPU temps dropped to 83 degrees Celsius. That's a 7-degree difference just by removing this right here. And the GPU dropped to 67 degrees Celsius. It's another 3 or 4 degrees Celsius drop. Again, just by removing this right here. So it's pretty incredible to see how something like this, just by removing this, can drastically reduce those temperatures for the CPU and the graphics card. If you have this stuck against another one like this, it becomes almost as restrictive as an acrylic or tempered glass front panel. That is a shame, frankly. It's something that I think Enermax just overlooked or didn't think about, so I strongly urge them in future revisions of this case and others to forego the second dust filter, especially if you're going to use a filter up front that already looks like this to begin with. This is going to do the job in and of itself, right? You're going to have a little bit more dust come in because you're choking it, but you're choking airflow as well, at the expense of also choking dust. And to me, that's just not a compromise worth considering. So in general, my assumptions about this case were true. When I first pulled out that front panel, I was like, there's no way that this thing is going to be anywhere near as porous as they probably think it is. I didn't expect it to be literally as choking as this is. That was a surprise, but I had my doubts when I first pulled out the mesh front panel. I was like, there's no way. Another cool thing about this that I didn't talk about, you can remove this very simply by clicking here and here, and then it just slides out. So there's 2 little tabs that kind of punch into the chassis up top, and then there's 2 little feet that slide into the chassis at the base, and that was how easy it was to remove. Again, when you put 2 of these in there, it just, you can barely even see through it. And that's a testament to how restrictive it is in terms of airflow, just based on the amount of light that it allows through it. When you remove one of these, it becomes suddenly much more transparent. It's still restrictive, but it's a lot less restrictive than it was before. Let me see if I can do this without looking up front. There we go. Boom. It's literally that easy. Like, it's a really nice feature of this case. It also works up top the same way. So very easy to remove. That's a plus, and just makes modifying the front panel, the top panel that much easier. So this takes like 20 seconds. Do it if you buy this case. It will make a world of difference. And you might have to clean your PC one extra time every 6 months because you'll have maybe a little more dust in your case as a result. But it's a worthy trade-off in my book. In terms of my thoughts about the value of this chassis, I think it's okay. It's not great. It's certainly not the best case I've ever reviewed, but it's far from the worst case I've ever reviewed either. There are some design cues that I would like to see addressed, especially with that just huge gap next to the motherboard tray. It just looks a little weird to me. The price is a bit high, but you are getting things that some people will pay extra for, like the huge RGB, DRGB inclusion up top and up front. You get the control panel, a huge fan hub, a huge RGB controller at the rear, and plenty of hardware support. So to some, they might see this justified. I'm not going to dock it for the price, but I'm not going to praise it either at 150 or so USD. So I'll let you conclude however you feel necessary to conclude in the comment section below. I'm gonna give this just an average score. Do I feel comfortable giving this away, especially with the caliber build going in it in the next video? Absolutely, especially when you modify the front and top panels. It's good to go. With that, you can find this case linked down below in the video description. You can also find other parts that we've used here for this exact config. If you want to build something similar, maybe in the black version of the Enermax Saberay, then feel free to do that. I think it would look really good in black, especially with these components. But the components we're going to throw into this case for the giveaway are going to be primarily white, so it should fit the theme a bit better. Again, stay tuned for that. If you like this video, thumbs up. You know what to do. If you're excited for the giveaway coming up next, thumbs up. That would be appreciated. Click the subscribe button to stay in the loop. Become a member if you're feeling especially fancy, and we will catch you in the next one. This is Science Studio. Thanks for watching, and thanks for building with us.